As the UN announces an investigation into the legality of US drone strikes, there's evidence that the Obama administration is escalating and institutionalizing the policy of assassination. And locked out, misery for ice hockey fans as the start of the NHL season is cancelled amidst a fight over revenue distribution. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. Earlier this year, Ben Emmerson, the UN Special Rapporteur on counter-terror operations, warned that the US may have committed war crimes with drone strikes that have killed civilians in Pakistan. On Thursday, he announced a special investigations unit is being established to look into the legality of such strikes. But all evidence suggests that far from being concerned, the Obama administration is actually increasing the ferocity of what it calls a targeted killing program. The Washington Post has revealed that the US government has compiled a database called the Disposition Matrix to, quote, augment, end quote, the existing kill lists, and which will focus on suspects beyond the reach of American drones. And just 10 days from Election Day, the Obama campaign is unapologetic about the program. Here's Obama's senior advisor, Robert Gibbs, justifying the killing of 16-year-old American Abdurrahman al-Awlaki in a drone attack last year.
Do you think that the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, who is an American citizen, is justifiable?
I'm not going to get into Anwar al-Awlaki's son. I know that Anwar al-Awlaki renounced his citizenship.
His son was still an American citizen.
Did great harm to people in this country and was a regional al-Qaeda commander hoping to inflict harm and destruction on people that share his religion and others in this country. And
that's an American citizen that's being targeted without due process of law, without trial, and he's underage, he's a minor.
I would suggest that you should have a far more responsible father if they're truly concerned about the well-being of their children. I don't think becoming an al-Qaeda jihadist terrorist is the best way to go about doing your business.
To discuss the implications of the administration's strategy, we're joined by Greg Miller, intelligence reporter for The Washington Post, who's been writing about the US program, and from New York, Hina Shamsi, who is director of the ACLU National Security Project. Hina, first of all, then, what more do we know about this UN investigation?
Well, it's a significant development, and transparency and accountability should start at home here in the United States. But in the absence of real transparency and any accountability at all, the UN investigators have appeared to want to step in and say the international community needs to look at the US's actions and determine whether they are in fact legal or not.
But how are they going to know the US's actions unless the US cooperates? Because I mean, it's top secret.
Well, and that's going to be a significant issue here, because in the courts here in the United States, the US has taken the position that the targeted killing program, and particularly the CIA's involvement in it, is a state secret and it cannot be discussed in court. So whether or not the US government cooperates with the United States is an issue that remains to be seen. And will affect the investigations going forward.
Greg Miller, I mean, let's look at the remit of these two special rapporteurs. One, counterterrorism and human rights, and then the other is a special rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, summary or arbitrary execution. I mean, these are pretty serious issues. Any suggestion that the administration is concerned about this?
No suggestion that I can detect. I think that the administration reiterated for us repeatedly in our reporting on our series of stories this week that they believe they're on firm legal footing for the drone campaign. Although, when you talk to experts, they believe that it gets increasingly tenuous the farther you get from 9/11, which was the pretext for the targeted killing program. And as you map out, as the Obama administration is now doing, a possible continuation of this campaign for as long as another 10 years.
Yeah, and we'll get onto that disposition matrix in a moment. But it's interesting, though, the amount of cooperation you did get, whether, even though perhaps you couldn't have people's names on the record necessarily. I mean, they're quite proud of this program, actually, aren't they? And then perhaps they thought this was quite good for the election campaign.
Well, I'm not sure that they thought about the timing of the election. We were reporting this story for quite some time, but I think there is an eagerness on the part of some of the officials in the Obama administration to explain their position. I mean, I think they hear the criticism and the skepticism, and it perhaps rings in their ears a bit. They firmly believe that they're doing the right thing. Some of them wish they could be more open in trying to explain it, but they see many obstacles that prevent them from doing so.
And I suppose, that some of that unease that there may be is because we have been getting more details about President Obama's widening of the program to signature strikes. I mean, the idea that people being in a certain area are clearly up to no good and can be targeted. The fact that any male in certain areas who looks like he could carry a gun is now thought of as a militant unless proven posthumously not to be. Double tap was the latest thing we heard of, I guess, where first responders and relatives are targeted. I mean, it's pretty astonishing how. I mean, they call it targeted, but I mean, how targeted do you think this is?
Well, and that's one of the main problems with this program, which is that even as government officials assert that this is legal, they've been unwilling to provide the legal memoranda upon which the targeted killing justifications rely. For example, the memorandum that we know exists because it's been reported on the front pages of the New York Times about the administration's justification for targeted killing of US citizens. And there are significant questions that remain about the legality, about the evidence, and about the process, including, for example, how it is that the administration would justify its position that it can declare people enemies of the state who are far from any battlefield and carry out their killing without providing evidence or justification more in public. And that is where I think we have a significant problem. Greg Miller and other journalists like him have done a significant public service, but to the courts, in response to Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, the government continues to say that the targeted killing program is a secret that cannot be discussed or defended. And that sort of secrecy shell game is what gives us great concern, because almost 50 years ago, the Freedom of Information Act was passed in part to prevent the government from selective disclosures and half-truths. But that, unfortunately, is what appears to be happening today.
Greg Miller, do you think in your article when you have staffers saying, well, John Brennan, his moral rectitude is peerless. I mean, he was even uneasy about the use of the BCC function on email, the idea of sending an email to someone without them realizing other people received it. I mean, it was that to say, look, trust us, we're the good guys. Is that what was going on?
Well, I think that's part of it, and I think that has.
So we don't need oversight.
Well, I think that does create a blind spot for some of the officials in this administration. They do believe they're doing the right thing, and it frustrates them that they come under these questions, but it's inevitable. So there's this disconnect. I mean, they would never, I don't believe, would allow another administration to say, trust us.
Right.
But they believe they've made significant improvements and sort of
let's get on to
make that argument themselves.
What is the disposition matrix? Beyond the kill list, then, the disposition matrix?
The disposition matrix is a database that is an extension of the existing kill list. It is essentially taking names of targets, but arraying alongside them all of the resources that the United States is putting toward capture or killing those individuals. So it's designed to encourage, if not require, much more extensive planning on the part of the government. And it sort of envisions, a conflict with Al-Qaeda that goes beyond the existing kind of drone war zones of Pakistan and Yemen.
So capturing is still an option, though. We had wondered whether killing was now the favored option because of the problems of Guantanamo.
Yes, I mean, capture is still an option, as we've seen in very few cases. I mean, there was the arrest of Warsami and his detention off the coast of Yemen last year. I mean, as you note, these are few and far between, but it does remain an option.
And as part of that matrix, it does mean cooperation with various nations that have terrible human rights records, who torture, who do.
I mean, that's part of what it maps out is if a suspect surfaces in a specific country where we aren't patrolling with drones, who can we turn to? Who are our friends who might be able to apprehend that individual on our behalf, and then what?
And does it always assume the cooperation of nations where a suspect effect turns up?
I don't think it would always assume that, no. I think that it would lay out contingencies for if that weren't available, what would you then do?
Hina Shamsi, from a legal point of view, where does this put your mind at rest?
It really doesn't, because what we're seeing is the entrenchment of a very, very dangerous practice. So anyone who thought that targeted killing was a narrow, exceptional measure is wrong. We are institutionalizing a practice of paramilitary killing without due process in parts of the world where we are not at war, and the dangers of imposing a death sentence without due process are clear. We don't know, for example, that the people that the government is seeking to kill in fact present a truly concrete and imminent threat to us. What we do know is that tragic mistakes have been made and that hundreds of civilian bystanders have died, that a 16-year-old US citizen has been killed without the government acknowledging, let alone explaining that killing. And this is a very dangerous direction that we have gone down in the last 4 years, and now it appears that we're permanently seeking to institutionalize it.
And you also, Greg Miller, in your series, go into the expansion of the base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier. And in fact, I mean, just in passing, you mentioned that you found out about F-16 combat sorties on Yemen, and I mean, things that we know nothing about them. And again, this idea of who is overseeing all this then?
Well, I mean, you would have would have committees in Congress who would be in position to oversee the activities of the military. But one of the problems is that in the war on terrorism, there is this convergence between intelligence agencies and the armed forces of the United States. So a lot of this activity increasingly falls into, even among the congressional committees that are supposed to conduct oversight, falls into a seam between them. I mean, can the committees monitoring the CIA keep track of what the Joint Special Operations Command is up to, and vice versa?
And you discuss how all those different units work together, the CIA increasingly becoming a paramilitary force then. Although then there's a suggestion that John Brennan, Obama's counterterrorism advisor, is trying to roll it back, but not really doing anything. I mean, it's all a bit confusing, actually.
That's right. I mean, if you read our stories, we had a lengthy interview with John Brennan in which he portrays himself as somebody who has been a restraint on the CIA, and they have put in place some processes that allow other agencies to weigh in on questions about who gets added to kill lists and when decisions are made to conduct airstrikes and so forth. But yeah, I mean, during this administration's time in office, you have seen a massive escalation of the drone campaign in Pakistan and a multiplication of the number of drone bases around the world.
When you talk to these officials there, are they fine with other countries deciding that they should now do the same thing? Clearly an international precedent is being set here.
They have that in mind, and Brennan has mentioned this in his speeches on the drone campaign. So part of what prompts them to discuss this, part of what prompts them to try to institutionalize aspects of it is they believe that if they do it right, they can perhaps set a model that other nations would follow. Even members of the administration acknowledge that may be more than a bit naive, but it is something in the backs of their minds.
Hina Shamsi, I mean, it's an election year. We've been talking about national security strategies. Mitt Romney actually said, no, we can't kill our way out of this, but this appears to be the institutionalization of killing our way out of this, an endless stream of alleged jihadis and whomever's in their way.
Well, I think what's dangerous here is that we're seeing a bipartisan consensus congealing around the idea that we can, in fact, kill our way out of this. But the evidence on the ground shows that that's not the case. We actually have more people opposing the US targeted killing policy, and I think that we are going to end up creating more enemies than it will possibly ever kill.
I mean, yes or no, do they ever talk about the causes of terrorism? Of
course they do. They do. I mean, I think that they are aware of the other implications of the drone campaign. Right, well, they feel they're in position that's a much harder thing to confront and to figure out what to do about. I mean, the drone...
Greg Miller, we'll have to leave it there. It was fascinating. Okay. A great series in the Washington Post. Thank you very much, Greg Miller. Hina Shamsi, thank you. The National Hockey League has announced that all games in November have been cancelled as an increasingly bitter dispute between players and owners goes into its 41st day. Al Jazeera's Daniel Lack reports from Toronto, where, as you might expect, fans aren't terribly happy.
It doesn't get much more Canadian than this. Friends getting together at an arena to play hockey for fun. But in the big leagues, the NHL, the dressing rooms are empty as players and team owners keep failing to agree how to share billions of dollars in ticket sales.
Like, they're pretty close, so why not finish it and get it done and have a season?
Guys, get it done. Like, it's unbelievable that these guys actually have to stand around and negotiate for 8 years. Come on, get back on the ice.
More than just a sport here, hockey is a passion, part of the national character. But more than 100 games have already been cancelled. Will the faith of fans finally waver as billionaire owners argue money with millionaire players? It depends who you ask.
Baseball is on, football's doing great. When hockey comes back, they just might not bother. And that's going to be a bigger financial burden than, I think, whatever they can get back from the players.
People are going to be annoyed. They're going to be, absolutely affected by this arrogance. But at the end of the day, hockey fans will come back. And everybody knows that, especially the owners.
Of course, nothing that happens at the pinnacle of the game, the NHL, will stop Canadians from playing hockey. But 3 player lockouts in 20 years have taken their toll, and fans are growing weary of the big money brinkmanship that often seems to dominate their favorite sport.
The current dispute aside, there's almost an air of reverence in this hall, where school groups come every day to see the sport's 120-year-old trophy, the Stanley Cup. Getting the lockout resolved as soon as possible is probably the only way that players and owners can make sure these fans of the future continue to see hockey as the game of their lives, as it has been for generations of Canadians. Daniel Lack, Al Jazeera, Toronto.
So what will it take to get the hockey season started, and why are labour disputes so common in North American sport? To discuss this, we're joined by Dave Zirin from The Nation magazine and Steve Wino, who writes about hockey for The Washington Times. Steve, ostensibly then this dispute is about revenue sharing, and yet both positions seem to be pretty similar. They both seem to be suggesting a 50-50 split now, except maybe on a slightly different time frame. What's the problem?
The problem is that the owners and the players are so philosophically different on what they want out of this new CBA. Owners want shorter contracts, they want better control over player movement, and they want an even split of revenue, while players, their most paramount need is wanting to honor existing contracts. Some teams have handed out 10-year, 13-year, $100 million contracts, and the owners want to take some of that money back. The players at this point are determined to eventually move down to 50-50, realizing that's probably where they're going, but they don't want to give up the money that's already been promised to them by owners.
What about the framing, Dave? I mean, we heard there Daniel Lack suggest, well, look, in the end, this is just a spat between billionaires and millionaires. I mean, it's pretty unseemly, frankly. What would you make of that?
Yeah, it's problematic for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, we should be clear, this is not a labor dispute, which makes it sound like a weather pattern or something. It is a lockout. It is an owner's lockout. It means the owners have locked the doors and said that the players cannot come to work. Now, why this is bigger than just billionaires versus millionaires is that when the owners lock the door to a stadium, when they lock the door on the season, they're also locking the door on the tens of thousands of people who work in industries either related to hockey or even in like the restaurant next door, picking up an extra shift as a waiter or waitress at the bar near the arena. They're also locking out the tax base that gets generated by people traveling to the arena and spending money there. I mean, they're locking out so much more than just the players themselves, and that needs to be acknowledged. It also needs to be acknowledged that after a year of record revenues in the NHL, the players have said, we would be willing to keep playing while we negotiate. We don't need to lock the doors. So the fact that the owners in the NHL, not to mention other sports, have adopted this lockout strategy is punitive, it's problematic, and it's something that really represents a break from how labor negotiations in sports have been done in the past.
Right, but do you think the players are being unreasonable in their demands, though?
Well, no, I don't think they're being unreasonable, because one of the things that I think we're taught, certainly in Western society, is that a contract should be worth the paper that it's printed on. And players have signed these contracts. No one had a gun to the heads of ownership when they handed out these 10 or 13-year contracts. And the fact that owners, once again, in a year of record revenues, where a minority of teams, yes, are losing money, but a majority of teams are doing very well, are trying to solve their financial crisis by putting their hands in the pockets of players, I think that's the philosophical difference, which is so difficult for players to swallow.
Steve, why not put this into the wider sporting context for us? I mean, this is the fourth lockout in 14 months in sport. We had the National Football League, the players of the NBA and then the referees of the National Football League again. I mean, and that one was weird because it even led to right-wing politicians calling for union rights, apparently, by the end of it. I mean, what's going on, do you think?
I think the issue is, and it started with the NFL players lockout, is the owners did want to get a control on players' share of revenue. It started out, at least in hockey, at the end of the last collective bargaining agreement, with players getting 57% of hockey-related revenue. And now owners in hockey see what happened with the NFL and its Players Association and the NBA and its Players Association and say, here's a precedent that was set saying we should split these revenues 50-50. And as David was saying, it is a collective effort maybe by owners to try to rein in the power of the guys who were creating a lot of this revenue in the players.
But do you think, Dave, this is an organic process there that the hockey management looked at what happened in other sports and went, hey, we should try the same thing? Or is there something a bit more coordinated going on, do you think?
I think it's a bit more coordinated because it's less about hockey owners noticing what's happening and more about the legal advice that they're getting about the best way to pursue these negotiations. I mean, for the first time in the history of American sports, all 4 sports leagues, even though the NBA, Major League Baseball, the National Football League, and the National Hockey League, even though they're 4 very different financial considerations, 4 very different ways of dividing revenue, 4 very different television deals, they're all represented by the same law firm. They're called Prescower Rose. They operate out of New York City. Gary Bettman, who's the commissioner of the National Hockey League, and David Stern, the commissioner of the NBA, are both former partners at Prescower Rose. And it does look like, by all accounts, by all consideration, and by the people I've spoken to on both sides who've been at the negotiating table, that there really is a unified strategy that speaks to exactly what Steve said, this idea of wresting control back from the players' associations.
Is it any coincidence that we're seeing that occur as there's a wider attack underway, Dave, on collective bargaining, union rights, previous agreements on benefits and so forth? I mean, is that just coincidental, do you think?
I don't think it's coincidental for 2 reasons. I mean, first of all, the era of the sort of mom-and-pop sports owner whose the franchise is handed down from generation to generation is about as out of date as Leave It to Beaver. I mean, most sports owners now, they come from that world of business. And the second point I would make is that this idea of the lockout, owners locking the door of a company, a factory, a corporation, they've been on the rise dramatically in the United States. I mean, since 2010, the amount of lockouts has doubled. And this was something that in decades past really was seen as the third rail of labor negotiations, something that rarely, if ever, happened.
I mean, it's interesting to see it's the same sort of right-wing operative names sort of pop up both in political disputes and union disputes in industry and in sports. Frank Luntz, the Republican operator, is a name that popped up here and so forth. I mean, it is weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that was an eye-opener. I don't know if Steve saw that story as well about Frank Luntz advising the NHL, but that one actually, even an old cynic like me, I looked twice when I saw that.
Steve?
I did see that story, and I was a little perplexed at the NHL going to Frank Luntz and trying to get advice from him, given that it seems like the PR spin in this entire operation is very simple. We want to play hockey, and it's something that the Players Association is kind of drawn out there. But to have a focus group like Frank Luntz ran in Washington and was going to run in New York City before Deadspin broke the story, I guess is a little surprising because the NHL tried to keep it secret and really denied the existence of it afterward. And then you see a couple days later they come out and basically follow the advice of Frank Luntz and what came out of that focus group in the latest round of negotiations and making their collective bargaining agreement proposal public.
So public opinion, very important, as we saw with the NFL referee dispute. I mean, where does that lie right now, Dave, do you think?
Oh, I think Steve could answer that as better than I could. But from what I read, I think most fans are just very upset that people aren't on the ice playing right now. They can read the same papers that we read. They see that last year was record revenue, and they can't understand why a decision just can't be made.
Steve, very quickly.
Yeah, I think when the whole thing started, I think people were on the players' side saying, why are owners trying to take all this money away? But now everyone's just upset at everyone, saying, why can't we just get a deal done? Even President Obama came out and said it this week on The Tonight Show, get a deal done, you guys should be able to figure this out.
Dave, very briefly then, I mean, you say that sports now should be looked at in the same way that we look at big oil, for example. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. Well, because I think the industries are very similar. And Prescower Rose, the law firm that I mentioned, they also represent Chevron and Exxon ExxonMobil and BP America. And if you think about it, like the same things that those oil companies really want and need, like, for example, money from the government. I mean, that's a big issue with pro sports franchises as well, getting public funding, as well as a secrecy aspect to as well, of not being able to actually see how the books are being cooked. I mean, it takes a certain kind of legal mind to be able to defend both ExxonMobil and the National Hockey League, and I think we're seeing a lot of unity of theory in how the lawyers are operating in these cases.
Dave Zirin, thank you very much. Steve Wino, thank you. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.